Waitress Louise secretly shared her lunch with a homeless man at a Chicago cafe, until one day he walked in wearing an expensive suit, causing everyone to freeze. In the morning, when the alarm clock rang at 6, 35-year-old Louise realized that this day would change everything. Her weary life with 2 jobs and caring for her nephew was about to collide with a secret that no one expected. The morning in Chicago began as usual, with the sharp sound of the alarm clock at 6 o'clock. Louise, a 35-year-old woman with tired eyes, reached out to silence the annoying sound. She sighed, feeling the weight of the last few years pressing down on her shoulders. 2 jobs, caring for her nephew Michael, and endless bills. That was her reality after her sister died in a car accident 3 years ago. Louise was now the only support for Michael, who had recently turned 15. She forced herself to get up, pulled on an old sweater, and wandered into the kitchen. The toast was already sizzling on the stove, and the smell of peanut butter filled the air. Louise spread it on the bread, thinking about how quickly time was passing. Michael was growing up, and she was trying to give him at least a little stability despite the chaos of their lives. When she finished breakfast, she went up to his room and gently shook him by the shoulder. "Time to get up, sweetie. It's going to be a long day." Michael groaned something unintelligible and pulled the blanket over his head, but a second later he smiled when he saw her warm gaze. "You always say that," he muttered, rubbing his eyes. "Because it's true," Louise replied, trying to hide her fatigue behind a playful tone. She packed him a lunch, a sandwich, an apple, a bottle of water, and walked him to school, which was a few blocks from their cramped apartment. Waving goodbye, Louise hurried to the Old Oak Café, where she worked as a waitress. This place had once been the heart of the neighborhood. Cozy tables, the smell of freshly brewed coffee, the laughter of patrons. But now the wallpaper was faded, the lights were dim, and the flow of customers had dried up. The place was kept afloat by a couple of regulars, and even they came more out of habit than anything else. Louise entered through the back door, tied on an apron, and greeted her colleagues with a tired smile. "Good morning," she said, even though the morning had long since ceased to be good. "Didn't get enough sleep again?" Her coworker Jessica teased her as she poured coffee. "I'll sleep in someday," Louise joked, though she didn't believe it herself. The day dragged on. She delivered orders, wiped tables, and listened to customers complain about cold soup. But at some point, her gaze fell on the street outside the window. There, at the entrance, sat a man. He looked homeless. He wore a worn jacket, his hair was tangled, and his shoulders were slumped. He wasn't begging for money or holding a sign, just sitting there, blending in with the gray sidewalk. Louise froze, watching him. Passers-by avoided him, some casting contemptuous glances. Her heart sank. She remembered how she herself had once been on the brink, unemployed, with a pile of debts. Her sister had helped her then, and now Louise couldn't just walk by. She grabbed her bag, took out her lunch, a turkey sandwich and an apple, and went outside. Sitting down next to the man, she asked quietly, "Are you hungry?" He raised his head. His eyes, tired and deep, met hers. After a pause, he nodded. Louise broke the sandwich in half and handed it to him. "It's nothing special, but it'll tide you over," she said with a slight smile. The man took the food with trembling hands. "Thank you," he said hoarsely. His name was Esteban, as she later found out. They sat in silence as the noise of Chicago faded around them. Louise felt a strange sense of peace sharing this modest meal with a stranger. But the idyll did not last long. Richard, the manager, rushed out of the cafe. His face was red with irritation. "Louise, what are you doing?" he barked, crossing his arms. "This is a restaurant, not a charity." She stood up, trying to keep her voice steady. "He's not bothering anyone, Richard. Not bothering anyone." He snorted. "People like him scare away customers. Do you want us to be shut down? Stop this, or you'll be sorry." Louise clenched her fists, but said nothing. Esteban glanced at her apologetically and said quietly, "Don't argue because of me." "It's not because of you," she whispered, watching him walk away down the street. Back in the cafe, she caught Richard's disapproving glance. "Last warning, Louise. Reputation is all we have left," he said, walking away to the bar. Jessica, standing nearby, whispered, "He's just taking his anger out on you. But be careful, okay?" Louise nodded, but inside she was boiling. She didn't care about reputation if it meant ignoring someone in need. She didn't know that Esteban would return the next day, not as a lonely shadow at the entrance, but with a secret that would turn her life upside down. For now, she returned to work, serving coffee and smiles, though her thoughts were far away. Something told her that this encounter was just the beginning of something bigger. The next morning in Chicago was cold and gray, as if the city was anticipating a storm. Louise, as usual, entered the Old Oak Café through the back door, tied on an apron, and set to work. Thoughts of yesterday's argument with Richard wouldn't leave her. She tried to focus on the orders, but a feeling of injustice smoldered in her chest. Why was helping someone a crime? Why did Richard see everyone who didn't fit into his picture as a threat? The day went on as usual, the clatter of dishes, the smell of coffee, occasional conversations with colleagues. Jessica, noticing her thoughtfulness, whispered, "Don't worry about it. Richard is always like that when things are going badly." Louise nodded, but the words did not reassure her. She glanced out the window, hoping to see Esteban in his usual spot by the entrance. But he wasn't there. Maybe Richard was right, and she had only done harm by showing kindness? By lunchtime, the hall was filled with its usual buzz. Regular customers discussed the weather. Someone complained about the tasteless pie. Louise was carrying plates when the front door creaked. She looked up and froze. Esteban entered the cafe. But this was not the man in the worn jacket she had seen yesterday. He was wearing a dark blue suit that fit perfectly, his hair was neatly combed, and his gait exuded confidence. He looked as if he had just stepped out of an office on Wall Street, not off the cold sidewalk of Chicago. The room fell silent. The patrons looked at each other, some whispering. Jessica dropped her spoon and muttered, "Who is that?" Louise felt her heart skip a beat. She recognized him by his eyes, the same tired eyes, but now there was a spark in them that she hadn't noticed before. Esteban caught her gaze and smiled slightly, as if they shared a secret. But Richard's voice broke the silence. He jumped out of the back room, his face red with irritation. "What kind of circus is this?" he barked, staring at Esteban. "Who are you? You think you can dress up, and now you're welcome here? Get out." Esteban raised an eyebrow but remained calm. "I came here as a customer," he said quietly but firmly. "Do you have a problem with that?" Richard snorted, sweeping his arm around the room in a theatrical gesture. "A customer? You? You're a con artist. You came here to get a free meal, and now you're wearing a suit and trying to fool us." The patrons shifted uneasily. Some nodded in agreement, others lowered their eyes, as if embarrassed by the scene. Louise felt the blood rush to her face. She stepped forward, clutching the tray. "Richard, stop it," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "He has a right to be here." Richard turned to her, his nostrils flaring. "A right?" he asked sarcastically. "People like him scare normal people away. Do you even understand what's at stake? This cafe is barely surviving, and you're defending some vagrant." "He's not a vagrant," Louise snapped, her voice trembling with anger. "He's a human being, and you can't talk to him like that." The room grew noisy. Someone muttered, "She's right," but most remained silent, waiting to see how the argument would end. Esteban, still standing at the entrance, looked at Richard with cold composure. "If my presence is disturbing, I will leave," he said, but there was not a hint of weakness in his tone. He took a business card out of his pocket and placed it on the counter. "But think about whether it's right to judge people by their clothes." Richard grabbed the card, glanced at it, and threw it back. "I don't give a damn about your pieces of paper. Get out of here before I call security." Esteban nodded as if he had expected this and headed for the door. But before leaving, he turned to Louise. "Thank you," he said quietly, and his eyes flashed with gratitude. The door closed behind him, and the room erupted in whispers. Louise stood there, feeling her cheeks burn. She wanted to shout, to run after him, but her feet seemed glued to the floor. Richard turned to her and pointed his finger at her. "Do that again, and you're fired." "Got it." She clenched her fists but said nothing. She needed this job for Michael, for their future. When the commotion died down, Louise noticed a business card lying on the counter. She picked it up before Richard saw. In gold letters on black cardboard was written, "Empire Foods." Below that was a name, Esteban Garcia. Her heart skipped a beat. Who was he? Why had he come here in a suit? And what did that scene mean? At home, after her shift, she opened her laptop and typed Empire Foods into the search bar. What she saw made her freeze. Esteban Garcia was the owner of a restaurant chain and one of the most influential people in Chicago. But why was he pretending to be homeless? And what should she do with this secret now? Louise went to bed with a heavy heart. She didn't know that tomorrow Richard would go even further, betraying her for his own gain. But one thing she knew for sure, she couldn't keep quiet any longer. The night in Chicago was cold, the wind howling outside the windows of Louise's cramped apartment. She lay in bed, but sleep would not come. Thoughts of Esteban Garcia's business card spun around in her head like a broken record. Empire Foods was a restaurant chain known throughout Illinois. And Esteban wasn't just a homeless man. He was a man whose name appeared in the news alongside figures in the millions. Why was he sitting outside a cafe in rags? And why had he come back in a suit? Louise tossed and turned until the alarm clock showed 3 in the morning. She got up, made herself some tea, and opened her laptop. The search returned dozens of articles. Esteban Garcia was a businessman who started from scratch, the son of immigrants from Mexico. His restaurant chain was famous not only for its food but also for its charity work, free meals for the needy, and youth support programs. One article hinted that he sometimes checked on his establishments incognito to see how his employees were doing. Louise's heart began to race. So the Old Oak Café was part of his empire? And he had seen everything. Her kindness, Richard's rudeness, the decline of the place. She closed her laptop, feeling a mixture of relief and anxiety. Esteban wasn't just a random person. He could change her life. But what should she do with this knowledge? Tell her colleagues? Stand up to Richard? Or keep quiet and hope he sorted things out himself? Louise looked at Michael sleeping in the next room. She couldn't risk her job for him, but she didn't want to put up with injustice anymore. The morning began as usual. Louise walked Michael to school, trying to hide her thoughts behind a smile. "You seem strange today," he remarked, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. "I just didn't get enough sleep," she dismissed him, although inside she was boiling. At the Old Oak Café, the day went on as usual. Louise was taking orders, but every minute she waited for the door to open and Esteban to walk in. However, Richard appeared instead, and he was in a worse mood than usual. He approached her with a sarcastic grin. "You had a good time last night, didn't you? Defending your client?" he began, crossing his arms. "Well, congratulations, now we have a problem." Louise frowned. "What are you talking about?" He threw a piece of paper on the counter. "Yesterday's sales report. $50 is missing. And you know who was the last one at the cash register? You." Louisa gasped. "That's a lie, Richard. I didn't even go near the cash register after lunch." "The cameras say otherwise," he snapped, although a shadow of uncertainty flashed across his eyes. "Either prove it wasn't you, or write a letter of resignation." She froze. It was a setup, and Louise knew it right away. Richard had been looking for a reason to get rid of her for a long time. Too many arguments, too little obedience. But accusing her of theft? That was a low blow. Her hands trembled, but she forced herself to stand up straight. "I didn't take anything." "Check the records," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I already did," he snorted. "And if you don't want any trouble, you'd better keep quiet." Jessica, standing nearby, whispered, "Louise, don't argue. He's serious." But it was unbearable to remain silent. She knew the truth. She knew Richard was lying. And at that moment, she remembered the business card in her apron pocket. Esteban Garcia, the man who saw her as more than just a waitress. Maybe he was her only chance? After her shift, Louise retreated to the back room, away from prying eyes. With trembling fingers, she dialed the number on the card. The long beeps seemed to last forever before a low voice answered. "Esteban Garcia. Who is this?" She swallowed the lump in her throat. "This is Louise. From the Old Oak Café. I need your help." The pause on the other end of the line made her heart skip a beat. "Tell me," he finally said. Louise told him everything. About the money trap, about Richard's threats, about how he had humiliated him yesterday. She spoke quickly, afraid he would hang up. But Esteban listened silently, without interrupting. "Tomorrow at 10 in the morning," he said when she finished. "I'll be at the cafe. Don't tell anyone." Louisa hung up, feeling her pulse pounding in her temples. She had taken a step that could cost her her job, or save her. But doubts gnawed at her. What if Esteban didn't believe her? What if he decided she was exaggerating? And how could she prove her innocence if Richard had tampered with the records? At home, Michael noticed her tension. "Something happened at work?" he asked, sitting at the table with his textbook. Louisa forced herself to smile. "Just a tiring day. Don't worry, sweetie." But he looked at her too intently. "You always say that when something's wrong." "I'm not a little kid anymore, Louise. Tell me the truth." She sighed as she sat down next to him. "I've been accused of something I didn't do." but I'll get to the bottom of it. I promise. Michael nodded, and a flash of anxiety crossed his eyes. Louise realized that she had to fight for him, not just for her job, but for justice. She wouldn't let Richard ruin her life the way he had ruined Esteban's yesterday. The night was restless. Louisa imagined tomorrow's meeting, rehearsing the words she would say. She didn't know that Esteban had already checked the cafe's security cameras and seen the truth. She didn't know that he wouldn't be coming alone, but with a lawyer ready to turn everything upside down. But one thing she knew for sure, that phone call was the beginning of the end of her silence. Tomorrow everything would be decided. The morning in Chicago greeted Louisa with a cold wind and gray skies. She had barely slept, her thoughts about the upcoming meeting with Esteban keeping her awake. Yesterday's phone call was a risky move, but there was no turning back. Richard had crossed the line by accusing her of theft, and Louise knew that if she didn't prove the truth, he would destroy her life. She woke Michael up as usual, trying to hide her anxiety behind her usual smile. "You're early today," he remarked, spreading peanut butter on his toast. "Yes, things to do at work," she replied, though her voice trembled slightly. After seeing him off to school, Louise hurried to the Old Oak Café. The smell of coffee was already in the air, Jessica was wiping the counter, and Richard, as luck would have it, was there, standing at the cash register with a smug grin on his face. When he saw Louise, he said, "Decided to show up? Well, let's see how you get out of this today." She clenched her fists but said nothing. The clock showed 9:50. Esteban had promised to be there at 10. Right on time, the door creaked. Louise turned around, and her heart skipped a beat. Esteban entered, but he wasn't alone. Walking beside him was a tall man in a strict suit, carrying a briefcase. Esteban looked the same as yesterday. Dark blue jacket, confident gait, a look full of calm strength. The room fell silent. The patrons sipping their morning coffee put down their cups. Jessica whispered, "What kind of show is this?" Richard frowned and stepped forward. "You again? I told you, you don't belong here," he barked, but there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice. Esteban raised his hand to stop him. "I'm not here as a guest. I'm Esteban Garcia, owner of Empire Foods. In this cafe, too." The silence was palpable. Richard paled, his mouth opened, but the words stuck in his throat. Louisa felt the blood rush to her face. She knew the truth, but hearing it out loud was something else entirely. Esteban scanned the room, his gaze lingering on her. Gratitude flashed in his eyes before he continued. "I've been watching this place for the last few weeks. I wanted to understand why it was losing customers, why the spirit that once existed here had disappeared. I came here as a homeless man to see you for who you really are. And you know what I found?" He paused, turning to Richard. "You, the manager who humiliates people for their appearance, who kicks out those who don't fit into his picture. And you," he nodded to Louise, "the woman who sees more in people than their clothes." Richard tried to object. I didn't know who you were. I thought you were just..." "Just what?" Esteban interrupted sharply. "A beggar? A crook? You judged me without knowing anything. And yesterday you framed Louise, accusing her of theft." The room gasped. Louise froze, unable to believe her ears. "How did he know?" Richard waved his hands. "That's a lie. She herself." "Enough," Esteban cut him off. He nodded to his companion. The man opened his briefcase and took out a tablet. "We have the camera recordings. Not the ones you tampered with, but the real ones from the company's server. Yesterday at 6 in the evening, you took $50 from the cash register and hid it in your pocket." Esteban turned on the video. On the screen, Richard looked around, reached into the cash register, and then quickly took out the bills. The visitors began to buzz, someone even whistled. Jessica whispered to Louise, "What a twist." Richard turned red, his voice breaking. "This is fake. I didn't steal anything. The lawyers will sort it out," Esteban replied calmly, nodding to his companion. "But as of this moment, you are no longer the manager." The room erupted in applause. Louise felt the tension drain from her shoulders. She looked at Esteban, not knowing what to say. He turned to her, his voice softening. "Louise, you showed me what real respect is. You shared your food with me when I was a shadow to everyone else. I want you to be the new manager." She blinked, stunned. "Me? But I have no experience. I'm just a waitress." "You have something that money can't buy," he replied with a smile. "Kindness and resilience." "That's enough." The patrons nodded. Someone shouted, "She deserves it." Louise felt her cheeks burning. She wanted to refuse. The fear of responsibility weighed heavily on her chest. But then she remembered Michael, his anxious look yesterday. For his sake, for her own sake, she had to try. All right, she said quietly. I'll try. Esteban nodded, satisfied. He turned to Richard, who was still standing with his fist clenched. You can stay, but only as a waiter. And you will learn from Louise how to treat people. Or you can leave right now. Richard shot a malicious glance at Louise, then at Esteban. This is humiliating, he muttered. It's justice, Esteban snapped. Richard stormed out of the hall, slamming the door behind him. The audience applauded again, and Louise felt a lump in her throat. She looked at Esteban. Thank you, she whispered. I didn't expect this. You deserve it, he replied. And not just the position. I'll give you a bonus, $5,000. So you and your nephew can breathe easier. Louise froze. $5,000 meant months without debt, a chance for Michael to take the design classes he had always dreamed of. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she held them back. I don't know how to thank you. Just do what you do, he smiled. Be yourself. When Esteban and the lawyer left, the room erupted. Jessica hugged Louise. You're the boss now. Don't forget us mere mortals. Louise laughed weakly, but inside she was still trembling. She didn't know if she could do it. She didn't know how Richard would react when he came back. But one thing was clear. This day had changed everything. Now she had a chance not just to survive, but to live. And she wasn't going to let it slip away. A month had passed since Louisa became the manager of the Old Oak Café. Chicago was gradually coming out of winter, and spring was in the air. For Louise, it was a time of change, not only external, but internal as well. She no longer woke up feeling like every day was a struggle for survival. The bonus from Esteban, $5,000, paid off some of her debts, and her new job gave her a stability she had long forgotten. For the first time in years, Louise could breathe more freely. The cafe also came to life under her leadership. She started small. She updated the menu, adding simple but tasty dishes, chicken sandwiches, soups, homemade pies. The chefs, who had long since lost interest, perked up, experimenting with recipes. Louise supported them, asked customers for their opinions, and made adjustments. But the main innovation was an idea that came from her conversations with Esteban, the pay for another program. Customers could leave money for food for those who couldn't afford it. A board with bright stickers appeared on the wall. Lunch is paid for, coffee for you. The idea worked. Regulars who used to complain about cold coffee now praised the warm atmosphere. New faces popped in out of curiosity after hearing about the cafe where they help. Even those who came just for a bite to eat left a couple of dollars for someone else. Within a month, the flow of customers had doubled, and at the Old Oak began to regain its former glory. Louise often caught herself thinking, this isn't just a job, it's a place where people feel needed. Richard returned a week after he left. He entered with his head bowed, without his former arrogance. I need a job, he muttered, avoiding her gaze. Louise could have refused. After everything he had done, the humiliation, the money scam, it would have been fair. But she remembered Esteban's words, respect for everyone. All right, she said. You'll be a waiter. And you'll start with a clean slate. Richard nodded and worked silently, without any outbursts. Sometimes she noticed him watching her, not with malice, but with something like respect. Louise had no illusions. He wouldn't change overnight. But if she could give him a chance, like Esteban had given her, that was something. Things were changing at home, too. Michael, noticing that his sister no longer came home from work exhausted, began to smile more often. He enrolled in design classes, a dream that Louise could now afford. In the evenings, he showed her his sketches, cityscapes, logos, clothing designs. Do you think I can get into college? He asked one day, sitting at the table with a pencil in his hand. Of course, she replied, looking at him with pride. You're already on your way. One quiet afternoon, Esteban stopped by the cafe. He wasn't there for work, just for a bite to eat. He sat down by the window, his favorite spot, and ordered coffee and a pie. Louisa finished giving instructions to the staff and sat down next to him. It looks different, doesn't it? He said, nodding toward the room full of people. Thanks to you, she replied, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. Esteban shook his head. No, Louisa. It's you. I just gave you a chance, and you turned it into something more. They paused, watching the visitors. Some were paying for meals for someone else, others were thanking them for the warm welcome. Esteban took a sip of coffee and said, Remember how we met? You shared your sandwich with me. Louise smiled, remembering that day. How could I forget? I thought you were just a hungry passerby. But you saw me as a person, he continued, his voice softening. That gesture changed everything. Not just for me, but for you too. You've created a community here, Louise. People will remember that. She felt warmth in her chest. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away. I just wanted to help, she said quietly. I didn't think it would lead to this. That's why you're special, he replied with a smile. Esteban left, leaving a tip and a note. Keep up the good work. Louise watched him go, feeling her confidence grow. She was no longer the exhausted woman who was struggling to make ends meet. Now she was a leader for the cafe, for Michael, for herself. That evening, when the hustle and bustle had died down, Louisa stood at the bar, looking out at the room. People were laughing, eating, sharing stories. The pay for the next one board was covered with stickers. She remembered her sister, how she always said, kindness comes back around. And now Louisa could see it with her own eyes. Michael blossomed, inspired by her success. His drawings hung on the walls of their apartment, and he dreamed of a future where he could create. Louise signed up for online business management courses so she could not only keep the cafe afloat, but take it to the next level. She began to think about her own establishment, a place where food and care would go hand in hand. One day, watching the sunset from the cafe windows, she realized that life was no longer weighing her down. For the first time in years, she felt hope, not a fleeting hope, but a real one. She knew there was still a lot of work ahead, but now that didn't scare her. The lessons of the past, kindness, perseverance, faith in people, became her strength. Louise smiled as she looked at the board with the words, lunch paid for. A small gesture that started with a sandwich changed everything, and she was ready to move on, knowing that even the simplest actions can change the world.